to set some context so that we
Thank
can
you.
have this
Go
discussion.
for it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's do it that way, and then you can interrupt me or direct me if you think that I'm not addressing some of the things that need to be addressed.
Okay.
But first of all, let me just say that I just want to commend. First of all, I want to commend Myra for bringing this whole workshop to the people that she loves and cares about. This is really an act of love for Myra, taking her experience and making it meaningful to others. And I want to commend you, Jenifer, for really extending yourself. And for the few minutes that I've been here while you're leading, I'm really very, very impressed with the work that's gone on and the preparation and the coordination and your passion for this.
And I want to commend my boss for making it possible for us to do this at Weinstein Hospice.
And I don't know how many of you know this. It's not important that you know it. I'm sharing this now only because I think it's relevant to our discussion. But thank God my parents are aging well, and they are healthy, and they are independent. And I dread the day when that is not the case, like everybody else. And I did not anticipate having the intense and intimate relationship with Weinstein Hospice that I had last year when Hashem directed that we end up taking in a hospice patient into our house who actually didn't die in our home. He died 48 hours after he left our home in a hospice, but we had hospice care in our house. And so I just say that, given that I'm this intimidating halacha guy, and Weinstein Hospice and Miriam and I worked very well together, and it can work. It can work, and there may be certain assumptions and certain premises that Weinstein Hospice or that hospice care in general has. That halacha doesn't have, and we'll talk about those. Okay. So, this is the year of the disruptor. We got the Trump disruption, we have the Sanders disruption, and that seems to be the modality of discussion nowadays. So I'm here to disrupt some assumptions and just to present some of the halachic perspectives on some of these issues. And we'll see. We'll try to get as specific as we can when and if we need to, without taking too much time from all the other things that you need to do. I guess, first of all, the first thing we need to do is realize that from a halachic point of view, there is no one way. Thank you. There's really no one approach. Meaning, there's no general blanket directive that a person can issue, and after that, you've taken care of all the decisions. The halachic response to the various milestones in the treatment of a person at end of life is just like the medical response, which is you have to know the patient, and you have to know the data, and you have to know the situation. You cannot say that because of a particular broad, sweeping healthcare directive that therefore that thing takes care of all the decisions and they no longer have to be looked at point by point. So there really is, in the cases that I interact with members of my congregation, there really is no moment where things get simple. I have to tell you, it does not get simple. As the situation develops, as the situation deteriorates, as the situation improves, the way that we would treat or what we would withhold or what we would not insist on halachically changes depending on the situation. And I'm sure Weinstein will tell you that there are hospice patients about whom everyone agrees there should be no more medical intervention other than palliative care, and then the patient actually rallies and becomes a non-hospice patient, and actually leaves hospice. And goes on to lead a life, maybe not totally what we would call normal and independent, but meaningful and not involved with terminal life decisions, and then becomes a hospice patient again, or doesn't, or dies outside of hospice. So the situation is fluid, and halachically it's certainly a very complex issue. You cannot make general assumptions about a particular patient and then move on with those general assumptions. They've got to be revisited as the situation changes. I'm routinely involved, sometimes, I don't want to exaggerate it, sometimes hour by hour, with people in the community who are caring for a dying person, and there are different decisions that have to be made. I was once in a conference with a family in the conference room in a hospital, and the doctor comes running in the middle of the conference and says, the patient is coding. Do you want us to intervene or not? Right there on the spot. And my recommendation strongly at that moment was no. In that particular case, because of the situation and because I had the medical information necessary to make a halachic, to give halachic feedback, such as what is the likelihood that the patient can rally as a result of this intervention? What is the condition? In that case, it was congestive heart failure. Will this be simply a delay of another cardiac arrest in a few hours or a day or two? Or is it possible that, given the state of this patient's heart, that it could be 6 months before there'll be another cardiac arrest or that kind of thing? So those kinds of questions were very important. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So that would be an example. But I'll give you an example. I'm looking at that. Can we turn that off so I can look at the people and not them? I keep on looking at them. We'll get back to it. I like to look at people, not the thing on the wall. Anyway. Letter B. If not, okay, I'll just be careful. I'll just look at people. I keep on referring to that. There's nothing up there.
You can just turn it off at the computer. At the projector. Just turn the light off.
Yeah. Okay, great. Good. Okay, good. Now I feel like I can talk to you. Okay. For example, I have at home a 6-volume encyclopedia of medical halacha. Which goes through, who's it by? It's by a Rabbi Isaac Zilberstein, who is the son-in-law of Rabbi Eliashiv, who is the 100-plus-year-old Pasek Hador, General Halachic Decisor for all of the Jewish people. And he wrote that in close coordination with medical directors of various hospitals in Israel. Rabbi Isaac Zilberstein is actually a medical expert, Jewish halachic medical expert. And it's all in Hebrew. The whole thing is in Hebrew. He has a whole glossary in the back translating Hebrew terms into English terms and vice versa. And that just gives you an example of how complex these things can be. All right, so let's go through this. First of all, I wanted to, can I take questions or comments?
So the kids are there for 6 weeks. When my husband coded, and I called you, you already called for the ecstasy notice. And I keep wondering, why did that happen? Why did you get a call before I did?
That's a question you should ask him, not me. I just answered my phone.
I don't know the Scotch, I think it
Yes. And I'm not saying I disagree or agree. I'm just saying I can't tell you why he called me. I can just tell you I answered my phone. I will tell you, though, okay, that's a good, but the larger point I think you're really leaning. The larger point is that it is a good thing for those responsible for the care of a patient who cannot care for himself or make decisions to encourage conversation and coordination between physician and rabbi. Now, the person responsible for the care.
The primary caregiver of the...
I'm making an assumption in responding to you that you, in this case, not you, but any person in your situation, wants the halachic advice. This becomes very complicated because in many cases, as a matter of fact, in most cases, there are family members who are and family members who are not committed to a halachic process.
This is not a rabbinic question, this is not a medical question. In the case where somebody is in a life-threatening situation, and the physician wants to get in touch with whoever their primary caregiver is there a protocol? My son Jed got a call before I did also, which I was astonished.
I don't know. I'm not familiar.
I don't know. I know there's something you can put into your cell phone that's called ICE in case of emergency, and you identify. I don't know, but I'm not sure about that. But I want to kind of hold questions so we can get into this, and then we'll.
All right. So let me just give a certain contextual background, because to plunk down certain halachic rules or guidelines without the context would almost be meaningless. It'd almost be like coming into a French course and having some Greek guy come in and start talking Greek, and just because you're supposed to know he's Greek. So let me give you some background so we can appreciate some of the general halachic direction in this whole issue. So first of all, this whole workshop, entitled Kibud Av V'Em, honoring parent. So it's important for us to understand the uniqueness of that particular commandment in the Torah, because it's the only one of two places in the entire Torah where the Torah tells you that as a result of doing this, you'll get a positive result. In order that your life will be increased, right, or lengthened. So there are only two times in the entire Torah does the Torah tell us to do something, and then you'll get a result, right? And by the way, that result doesn't necessarily mean long physical life, but it does mean long life, eternal life. So there's a guarantee in the Torah that honoring parents actually results in either and or long physical and or eternal life. So why is it that the Torah promises life as a result of honoring parents? So the reason is because the act of honoring parents is not only an act of gratitude, it's not just a question of paying parents back. As a matter of fact, very often it's not an act of gratitude. There are parents in the world who are selfish, mean, cruel, abusive, and totally narcissistic. There are parents like that, and they ran their entire childbearing years with total obsession with their own selfish well-being, and they hurt their children. And the Torah says you must honor those parents too. So it's not about gratitude. It is about gratitude when gratitude is in place. But there are times when we're obligated to honor parents even when we owe them nothing, or when we owe them something else because they've hurt us terribly. Why is that? Because there's one thing true about all parents. Absolutely, inescapably true about all parents. They made us alive. Okay? And therefore, in honoring parents, what we're doing is we're honoring our existence. We're honoring us. Honoring parents is honoring the fact that there's life in the world. That they, together with God, are the three partners in creating life. And so when the Torah says honor your parents, the Torah is saying not only honor mom and dad, but honor the third parent, which is the Creator himself. And in so doing, you're honoring the fact that God gave you life. When a person says, my life is not worth it because you hurt me, right? Or because I was abused, or because I don't like the way you raised me, or because you made me become an accountant and I wanted to become a doctor, or whatever it is. When a person says that, at that moment the person is ignoring the value of their life, right? So the point is that parents are a source, and we're supposed to honor our source. That's the whole idea. Now, the reason I mention that in this context is because this is all really about what is life. What is life? So Judaism would say, halacha would say, that life is a gift entrusted to us by God for a purpose. Now that's quite different than life is a gift entrusted to us for whatever we want to make of it. Judaism doesn't say that life is whatever you want to make of it. It will be whatever you want to make of it, but Judaism says that life is not given to you for whatever you want to make of it. Judaism says life is given to you in order to fulfill the will of the Creator, and it's not your life. It's actually as we're saying here, a pikadon, which is an item, a custodial object that's entrusted to you until it's taken away from you. So we are not the authors of our own destiny. We don't even get to say if we exist. As the ethics of our fathers say, against your will you're created. And that's a very profound statement, because what the Torah is saying is, you didn't even get here by your own choice. So why, right? You were plugged down here and nobody asked you if you wanted to be here. And so if your whole life is not up to you. Your very existence was up to some other being that preceded you. Your parents, all three of them, right? And therefore, Judaism says, why do you think that when you are alive, you have the right to make decisions about your life simply based on how you feel about it? It's not your life. You're entrusted with your life. You're a custodian of the life that was given to you, and your obligation is to return it in concert with the will of God himself. So it's really important for us to understand that, because it changes the whole perspective on some of the difficult decisions that we're asked to make. Another point I just want to make here is that there are opportunities in the dying process, in the caring for the dying, or in dying ourselves. There are opportunities that aren't available at any other time of life. This refers back to something that Jenifer said before, that some of us relate to. There is this default assumption that dying is the worst thing that could possibly happen. In Judaism, it's actually not the worst thing that could possibly happen. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that a person divorces herself from God. That's the worst thing that can happen. That a person says that my existence has nothing to do with God. And that means that a person actually cuts himself off from the Creator. That would be much worse than dying. Dying, as a matter of fact, is a passage. And it's a right, R-I-T-E, and a right, R-I-G-H-T, that we all have. We all have a right to die, and it's a rite of passage moving us to another existence. So it's not like it's all over, and that's why we actually want to do it right, R-I-G-H-T. But there are opportunities that are available during this period of life that are not available at any other time. So, for example, I just want to point this out. I've seen this happen, and I've seen it not happen. Parent-child relationships are complex, and they're not all perfect. And parents, even wonderful parents, can be resented or can cause frustration. And less than wonderful parents certainly can be resented and cause frustration. It is possible, it doesn't have to happen, it's possible that we can learn when parents become dependent on us, and when decisions have to be made for their care, we can actually learn to love them in spite of and even because of their frailty and their weakness and their imperfections. We can learn to accept them. So during a period of time of dying, we can actually come to a form of acceptance and let go of the resistance, because so often during life we think we've got to resist them in order to get through life, and then comes this helpless person who reminds us of our own mortality, because all of a sudden we're dealing with these creatures who were just absolutely immortal for so many years in our life, and all of a sudden they become very mortal, very, very terminal, very temporal. And then we realize that's going to happen to us too one day. And at that moment, we can start accepting certain things, and we can stop resisting. We don't have to resist them anymore. So there's an opportunity there that isn't there while they're actively making you miserable on purpose. Is an opportunity for forgiveness, right? In other words, a person can actually say, I can actually get to a point where they can actually forgive a parent for perceived sins or actual sins that happened, and not hold and resent forever. Because what a person doesn't want to do is go through life owning a resentment, because owning that resentment doesn't hurt anybody but the person who has a resentment, even though we think that by having the resentment we're going to get even with the person we resent. It never works that way. Then there's a great opportunity during this period of time to get complete. There are conversations that can happen. Again, not always, but I'm just saying these are opportunities that do present themselves from time to time, and if you're looking for them, they happen more often than if you're not looking for them. Where a person can get complete, where there are conversations that can happen, you can reminisce, you can remember things, you can say, Dad, I remember this time that you did blah, 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 blah. I don't understand why you did that. And he said something, and you go, oh my God, I have a different view of why he did that, or why he didn't do that. So if you get rid of the resentment enough to be able to have a conversation, a straightforward conversation, there can be completion. I have seen people during Shiva actually go through Shiva. Obviously, they are mourning the loss of a loved one, but they're also resolved. Like they don't have guilt, and they don't have anger, and they're just resolved, and they're just honoring the memory of the person that they loved, who was imperfect, who may have done all kinds of things inappropriately, but nevertheless, they don't have because they got resolved, because they got complete. So there are opportunities here. Another point I want to make about this whole thing is, okay, Jenifer, I mean, I'm not talking about intravenous, but is that okay? Yeah,
No,
I'm going to get there.
But you'll get there. That's fine.
Quickly. Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. So I just want to say this. You don't know how it's going to go. Okay? So whatever you're dreading, you don't know it's going to go that way. Whatever you're looking forward to, you don't know it's going to go that way. And not only that, if you allow it to go the way it goes and not the way you think it's going to go, if you just allow it to be the way it is, you'll be much more involved and much more present and much more connected to what's happening than if you spend your time resisting, dreading, and being afraid of what's coming next. But you don't know how it's going to go, and you don't know what gratification you can discover in actually doing the right thing regarding your parent or anybody that you're taking care of. So, and you also don't know, by the way, what frustrations will come up. It might be much worse than what you think. The point is, you don't want to spend your time looking down the road. You want to plan, of course, that's what this is all about. But you don't want to spend your time not living in today because of, oh no, what's going to happen or what you're going to do or what you're going to say. You actually want to just be with what's going on right now and don't assume anything, because when you're assuming, you're not living what's going on now. The other thing, another opportunity that's available here is the opportunity for your children to see how you're relating to your parents, because they will relate to you the way you relate to your parents. And if you complain, and if you resent, and if you're frustrated, and if you totally relate to it as nothing but a burden, or an imposition, or an interruption of life, or something unnatural that shouldn't happen, then that's what's going to happen with you. My wife and I have this tongue-in-cheek argument with our kids. My wife and I, this is the only thing my wife and I disagree on. My wife says, when and if I get to a point where I'm wearing diapers and I'm totally out of it, my wife says to the kids, put me in a home, forget about me, walk away from me, and don't worry about me at all. Okay? And I turn to my kids at that moment and I say to them, don't you leave me alone for a second. I want you changing the diapers. I want you as much as possible I want to be in your house, and I want your children to see you caring for me. And I say that because I love them. I don't care who takes care of me if I'm out of it. But I want them to be. And I think my wife is totally wrong, and whatever. But I think that I'd be depriving them. And the reason my wife and I can laugh about this is because we both know our kids are not going to listen to either one of us. They're going to naturally do the right thing. So it doesn't matter what we want, we'll get to that in a minute. All right, and then of course, as Jenifer said before, this is part of life. Dying is part of life. Nothing wrong with dying. It's going to happen to all of us, and it's the design of things. And you cannot go wrong when you die, because God created the whole concept of life and death, and therefore you can't go wrong. Nothing wrong with it. The truth is, I still do want to live forever. That's the truth. And there are moments when I think that I figured out a way to do that. But anyway. All right. We're getting to some of the specifics. So, as I said before, so life is not ours. So the point of halacha in general, the point of halacha, which means literally halacha, from the word haloch, to walk, which is to actually provide guidelines. The point of halacha in general is actually to deprive a person of the need to make emotional decisions based on the passions of the moment. The whole idea of halacha is that there are certain principles, and we don't want you to be stuck in the passions of the moment, making decisions arbitrarily because of how you feel, or because of what happened yesterday, or because of what the New York Times says in their editorial tomorrow, or whatever it is. We want you making decisions based on principles that are timeless, that come from a tradition of holiness, that come from a reverence for life, and therefore and you can be assured that they're not going to be changing from year to year or decade to decade based on supposedly new insights that human beings somehow develop. So halacha has certain basic guidelines. So first of all, the idea is that your life is not your own. Your life doesn't belong to you. You're living a life that was given to you and entrusted to you, as we said before. And therefore, for example, so we all agree that suicide is a problem, right? Suicide is prohibited. It seems like a wonderful solution for some people, but the point is that suicide in general, I'm talking about a healthy person killing himself, we seem to understand that that's not an appropriate thing, to the point where even a miserable person who has nothing to live for, who's standing on the edge of a ledge of a window on the 60th floor of a building, ready to jump. Society understands. You stop traffic, you get experts, you talk this person out of jumping, even though when he agrees not to jump, he has nowhere to go, he has nobody to take care of him, nobody to love him, and what is going on here? Why do we have that? The answer is because we believe that life itself has intrinsic value, and as long as one is alive, there are opportunities. So I want to share one thing with you. In a certain sense, it's a shocking contrast to prevailing society's notion of the value of life. In general, I would say, I'm making generalities here, but we kind of say that life is valuable if you can do X, right? If you're capable of doing X, then life is valuable. The article that's included here, so this woman found out from her father that he wanted to live as long as he'd be able to eat ice cream and watch football. That was his idea. Now, I'm not remarking that. That was his idea of what would be a way of measuring the value of life. Obviously, he didn't mean so I could eat ice cream and watch football the entire time. He just meant that would be a level of functionality that I could have some pleasure in life. That would be something worth fighting for, but anything less than that wouldn't be worth fighting for. In Judaism, we say that the existence of life itself has value independent of what a person can do with it. So, for example, I'll give you a couple examples here. The Gaon of Vilna, who is, by the way, recognized as a luminary even by the Gentile world, happened to have been in Vilnius a couple of years ago. I'm just amazed at how publicly they celebrate the fact that the Gaon of Vilna lived in Vilnius. They got statues of the Gaon there, and they have a street called Gaon Street in Vilnius right now with the anti-Semitism that I encountered on the street right there. They still, they're very proud of him. He's a big man. He died on Sukkot. He died on Sukkot. In the middle of Sukkot, I think he died on the third day of Sukkot. And as he was dying, he was crying. And they say to him, according to the story, they say to him, "What, you crying? I mean, you lived." The Vilna Gaon was a man whose life was like a model of perfection. They say that the most he ever slept on a single night was 2 hours because he was involved so much in Torah study and in teaching and in leading that he slept only 2 hours a night. Amazing. That's just one of the apocryphal stories they tell about him. So he's dying and he's crying. What are you crying about? You've got nothing to worry about. You're going to face your Maker. You're going to have perfection and holiness. And what are you crying about? So he says, I'm leaving a world where for a few rubles, or whatever the term was of the coin, for a few coins, I can acquire a mitzvah and serve the eternal one. And like an esrog, I can buy an esrog for a few dollars, so to speak, and I'm going to a world where for all the money in the world, I can't do a single thing, right? So the point is that there's an opportunity in this world to do things. Now, you say, well, what about a person who's not functional at all? So I want to turn something on its head, and that is, who is a giver and who is a taker, okay? Judaism says that, and I can prove this in many different sources, but I'm just giving you the bottom line. Judaism says that it's not as simple as you think. There are takers who are givers. I'll give you an example. My wife was sick about 20 years ago after our seventh child was born. She had 12 infections in 12 months. And she then took sick with no diagnosis at all, but she couldn't function. She couldn't function for months. We went to every expert in the region, CDC, whatever it is, and they could not give us any diagnosis. And when one doctor said that you're going to be sick the rest of your life, and you might as well get a psychiatrist to deal with that and get full-time help. And during that period of time, I'm sitting here trying to do my job and be a father and be a husband. I don't know what I'm doing. And people in the community are offering help. And I'm trying to be this hero, and I don't want to burden people. And it's also uncomfortable to take help, and I kept on saying no. Finally, somebody took me aside, and I'm a young guy then. I'm not as wise as I am now. And somebody took me aside and said, Rabbi, you don't get it. When you're saying no, you are actually depriving us of something. And when you say yes, you're giving us something, right? And that was an important lesson. The point is that a taker is not a taker. A taker is also a giver. If an infirm parent is allows him herself to be taken care of by a child who is the giver and who is the taker. Very often, a child will have grown so much by taking care of that difficult parent that the parent actually is the giver. And therefore, who's to say that that life of dementia and Alzheimer's, where the parent doesn't even know the name of the child, who says that that parent is a taker? That parent's life actually has tremendous meaning, because at that moment, that parent is actually a giver. And actually, that child is growing. And the life of the parent has now transformed the child into a different person who is more self-aware, more of a loving person, more of a giant person than ever before. So the point is that, there's a certain very two-dimensional view of giving and taking, and that colors our view of how we're going to take care of people. And so the idea of the value of life being, as long as I can do X, Y, and Z, is not so simple as we say. It's not, as we say in Gemara, it's not nish as a pasha. It's not so simple. Am I going too long on this?
No.
Yeah, I think she's saying yes.
Can you address the medical?
Yes. So okay, good. You want to know what to do. Okay. So now come these medical interventions. So number one, you cannot give a blanket do or do not, which means there are certain cases where you can say to the medical professionals, do not resuscitate. You can say that. What is do not resuscitate? Did you go? Okay. So do not resuscitate, by the way, is a very limited thing. Do not resuscitate doesn't mean do not treat. That's another order altogether. But do not resuscitate is limited really to cardiac intervention, pulmonary intervention, dramatic, heroic measures for cardiac and for pulmonary. Do not resuscitate orders can't be issued just because somebody said, if I get to a certain stage of my life, I don't want to have that intervention, because the patient's desire for treatment does have value and does have meaning in Jewish law, but not totally, because the care for the patient is not because the patient wants to be cared for. The care for the patient is because we're responsible for the life of the patient, and the patient is responsible for the life of the patient, and it's not up to the patient to decide when that life will end and when not, or under what conditions. And therefore, according to Jewish law, the fact that a patient signed a certain healthcare proxy, or advanced medical directive, I should say, that says, if X, Y, and Z happens and I do not want to have any heroic measures taken, that doesn't mean anything according to Jewish law. Now, it gets very complicated on the ground, because most of the time, at least the cases that I'm involved with, you may have an halachically oriented caretaker who wants the opinion of the rabbi, but that caretaker is not the only family member involved in the care of the patient, and not the only one authorized to make decisions. And so then it becomes the job of the rabbi not only to respond halachically, but also to give advice as to how to manage the interaction with the rest of the family. And sometimes the advice is surrender, because you do not want to disrupt, given the fact that other people are not necessarily oriented to the same thing. You cannot have a fight over the deathbed of a loved one that will last for years afterwards. And so very often a person is powerless, or should see him or herself as powerless in making some of these things, because you've got to respect the fact that there are other family members who are not asking for halachic advice. Yes?
I have you said do not resuscitate is not the same thing as
As do not treat. Okay. I think there's a medical term for do not treat. I forgot what it's called. I have it here in my notes.
Well, usually they're specific about what kind of treatment you want or don't want.
Yeah. It's actually, the DNT do not treat. Yeah. I mean, do not resuscitate is specifically about heroic measures for cardiac, or pounding on the chest, or intubation.
It's about chest compression. DNR is about chest compressions and is about defibrillation, shocking people. It's for when your heart stops. Do you want them to do something to get your heart started again? Well, it's the same category. If you're in a coma and your heart stops beating, do you want them to get it started again? Or if you stop breathing, do you want to be mechanically ventilated?
Is that different than DNR? Is that DNI?
DNI is do not intubate. That's one thing. That's the do not resuscitate. That doesn't speak to whether you get fluids. That doesn't speak to whether you take antibiotics. That doesn't speak to anything else. It only speaks to getting your heart started again, or getting your breathing started again.
Now, the halacha deals with the following question. How much pain and suffering is a patient obligated to undergo in order to prolong life or to regain life? Right? So, for example, let me give you a painful, emotionally painful scenario. Actually, I had a grandmother who went through something very similar, which is the doctor says, we need to amputate your leg, or legs. Okay, let's make it legs. You need to amputate your legs. If we do, you'll live. If we don't, you'll die. Patient says, I don't want to live without legs. Right? Halacha says that you tell the patient you're obligated to amputate your legs. Because who says that you have a right to decide that you're going to die rather than live? You're going to live without legs, and people will have to. You won't be ambulatory, but you'll be aware, and you'll be at the bar mitzvah of your granddaughter, grandson, or whatever it is, and you'll whatever it is. But so halacha says that you say to the patient, according to Jewish law, you're obligated to live, and you need to go through this operation. And the patient says, I don't want to. And so you continue to talk to the patient, You don't arrest the patient and put them in jail, but you talk to the patient and explain to them what the halachic direction is. So the point is, how much pain and suffering does a patient have to go through in order to prolong life? So that becomes it's a different issue. So prolonging life is different than you're going to die if you don't have this procedure, you're going to live if you do have this procedure. Prolonging life is, if you go through this procedure, you can live for 6 months. If you don't go through this procedure, then you're going to die right away. But this procedure is terribly painful. It requires surgery. It requires broken bones. It has a high percentage of hearing loss or something like that.
Infection.
Or in fact, that kind of, exactly. So,
or dementia.
Okay.
Decline.
Okay, got it. Right, so there are likely side effects from this procedure, and it won't save your life until you die of something else. It will prolong your life, and you'll die of this later, right? So that's where advanced healthcare directive really becomes relevant in Jewish law, because there, a patient can say, I don't want to undergo pain and suffering in order to prolong my life, right? And now we know that. Okay, that's different. Many patients will say, I do want to undergo pain and suffering in order to prolong my life. I just signed a healthcare directive with somebody in the community who says, I want all measures taken to prolong my life, no matter what. Okay? So we would not require that of the patient. Let's say the patient has no advanced care directive, and you're the caretaker, and you're trying to make decisions for that patient, and some painful intervention is called for, or is the only option available. So halacha allows us to make the most reasonable assumption for what a normal person would want in such a situation. Meaning halacha doesn't say the family decides if they want that person to go through it or not, or if they feel that they know the person, because that's an extremely subjective type of a thing. Rather, halacha says, would a normal person want to go through this level of suffering in order to be able to have prolonged life? It's a gray area. It's a very difficult thing. The point is that we don't say it's painful, let the person die. Very often, when we're saying that, what we're saying is we, the caretakers, don't want to see the patient suffering, therefore let's let the patient die. That's not appropriate according to Jewish law. What we're dealing with is the pain and suffering of the patient, not the pain and suffering of the caretakers. Caretakers are required to go through all kinds of emotional difficulties in order to provide the proper halachic standard of care for the patient. even though it's very difficult on them. So, yeah.
I have a question I want to raise. So you were giving the example of the person that would need to have limbs amputated or they would die, which is not impossible. If you get some kind of cellulitis, you have an infection, you have a circulatory problem so that the blood isn't circulating to your limbs.
Yeah.
These things can happen. Part of the issue is a lot of people don't just have one problem, particularly old people. They have multiple problems. So let's say you got this problem with your limbs, but in addition to that, you have, a cardiac problem, or you have a respiratory problem, or you have dementia.
Right.
That you may prolong life on one front, which does not take away from all the other things. And so then the question is, are we prolonging life or are we prolonging death?
Right.
And
that's correct.
What's the...
So first of all, that's exactly, that let's say is exactly why each situation is different, and you have to know what patient you're dealing with before you respond. Halacha does not say prolong life at all costs. Let me make that clear. Halacha does not say at all costs intervene to prolong life. Halacha says, principle number one, if there is a medically reasonable chance of turning around the symptoms, of reversing the symptoms, or giving a person stability so that the cascading series of events is interrupted, if there's a medically reasonable chance, then take that medical intervention, because there's a chance that you're going to be acting consistent with the directive of the Torah, which is heal. And healing doesn't mean only when you know it's going to work. Healing means when you think it's going to work. You're not sure it's going to work, but you think it's going to work. So heal when you think it's going to work. But if there's no medical reason to believe that the patient is going to be healed or that the symptoms are going to be reversed, now we're dealing with prolonging life, or what you might say, prolonging the dying process. Then it becomes, we have to look at all kinds of things. How much life? What quality of life? What does the patient want in terms of how much pain and suffering to go through? That kind of a thing. One thing what we don't go through is what the family wants. Halacha doesn't care what the family wants. We're just not interested in that. It's an objective consideration. We're not interested if that family happens to be poor, or if that family happens to be tired, or if that family happens to not like the person who's dying, or whatever it is. We're not interested in their opinion. We're interested in as much as possible an objective standard of treatment. But every situation is different. There's no question about it. And by the way, there are medical interventions that sometimes cause other negative symptoms. So, for example, we use the term feeding tube. Very often, a patient who has problems with aspiration, who has a pneumonia problem, and now you want to introduce fluids. Sometimes introducing fluids could cause the patient to die of asphyxiation because the patient it's right. Exactly. So it's not so simple that we simply advise intervention at all costs. Again, each situation is different. There is a problem, and I noticed that there's another problem, which is that the medical personnel you're talking to very often have their own biases in terms of what they consider to be a valuable intervention. You experience that from the perspective of hospice. I experience that from the perspective of halacha. And so doctors have to be, a rabbi has to cross-examine a doctor very, very thoroughly. I don't like these 1-minute consults over the phone because the doctor's in a rush, you're in a rush, and very often the doctor makes very vague generalities. I had one case that sticks in my mind, just to give you an example, is a man that many people here in the community knew very well. I won't mention his name. He was sick in the hospital. He definitely had cardiac, he had congestive heart failure. And evidently in the hospital they discovered that through a procedure that he had cancer. And they needed to make decisions about what to do. The family asked me to be involved. I called the doctor. The doctor on call, his mate doctor that he knew for 30 years, was on vacation. And the doctor had said to the family that this man is never going to walk out of the hospital. So it just happened to be that his partner didn't know that the doctor on the doctor in charge of his care had said that. And when I spoke to his partner, he was reading off the charts, and he said, I think this patient is treatable. Anyway, so that already gave me an insight. One doctor is saying he'll never walk out of the hospital. This doctor is saying he's treatable. Anyway, it happened to be that in that particular case, he walked out of the hospital, ended up being the person who opened the Minion doors every morning at 6 a.m. for 2 more years. Okay? And this was somebody that the first doctor was saying do not treat. Now, that doctor wasn't wrong, and he wasn't bad, and he's not evil. He had the medical information that he thought he had, and he had his perspective. The point is that you got to be very, very careful because people have different ways of evaluating. I had a Baptist doctor who had a totally different view of what kind of intervention was appropriate, and a very religious view, and a very sympathetic to Jewish law. And he was dealing with a Jewish family that was willing to walk away from a patient who they thought was dying. And also in that case, the patient died a year and a half later. So I'm just saying I've been around, and I'm only a relatively small. I'm at a high volume situation, and yet in my experience in 25 years, I've seen some absolutely unpredictable results both ways. So the point is, this is not all in our hands. Now, the point is that there's a form here that basically appoints some rabbi or some organization to be the contact person, because you cannot simply make broad directives. You've got to.
This is in your book. It's called the Halachic Living Will, and it's in with the legal.
Yeah. All the more so because of the complications and because it's not so simple. All the more reason to have discussion with parents in advance to let them know that this is available, that the halachic living will is available, and to let them see that one way that this will go is that there'll be a partner in healthcare decisions called a rabbi who will be making assessments based on Jewish law, whose job is not to prolong dying, whose job is not to prolong the suffering of dying, but his job is to make sure that medical intervention, when it's called for by Jewish law, is done, and make sure that it's not done when it's not called for. Yes?
Could you clarify what role in halachically advanced directives has given what you're talking about?
It almost purely authorizes people to take extreme measures when halacha wouldn't require.
So it only goes one way, not the other.
Right. In other words, that's a very good point. Thank you. If there is almost no medical care directive that would say, don't treat me, even though halacha says treat me. Right. That we would say, okay, thank you very much for your opinion, but your life is not your own. We love you, and we have compassion for you. We're going to treat you because halacha says it. Now, the big issue is the discontinuation of existing medical intervention. Let's say a person is appropriately put on a respirator because that's what the treatment was called for, with the hope that the person will be able to be weaned off the respirator. And now it's clear that the person is literally on life support, which means the person will not be able to live without the respirator. And the person is in declining health and what they call a cascading series of events, heart failure, kidney failure, even pneumonia, whatever it is. The person's on all kinds of diuretics. And the person is not going to get better. Those kidneys are not going to be functioning, and dialysis is not an option, and whatever it is, a person's on a respirator. And they say, very often they would say, the family would say, there's no hope, and let's discontinue the intubation and the life support. Halachically, you're not allowed to do that. You cannot, according to Jewish law, it's considered to be murder if you take a dying person and kill him. If you take an action that will shorten a dying person's life, that's called murder. The classic case in the Talmud is a baby who is definitely going to die because he's on the way down from a 30th floor window, and somebody comes and knifes the baby on the way down. Okay, the person who knifed the baby is a murderer, even though less than a second later the baby would be dead. Yes.
I don't know if they're in use, but years ago they invented a respirator which automatically shuts off in 72 hours unless it's reset. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
I'm familiar with that kind of thing, not that particular
Is
thing.
that
Yeah.
different from shutting off as not resetting?
It may be. It may be. If it was put on that way, if it was put on with the idea that it may be. I would not make a ruling without further investigation. But what you're referring to, just for everybody's benefit, is the point. Does everybody understand the point here? In other words, they would have to take another active intervention in order to keep that may actually be advised in many cases. Yeah.
Are they regularly used in the U.S.?
What's that?
Are they regularly used in the U.S.?
I am not familiar with how regularly they used. I don't know. Do you know? You're not familiar with it either. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Sure.
Does stopping medications fall in the same category
As removing. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Again, it depends what the medications are for.
There's cardiac patients and they're, under hospice, for example, and they're mentally impaired, they're unable to tell you for themselves, and they're on 10 cardiac medications and all sorts of things.
Oh, you say like cardiac medication. So it's a very similar question that was just brought up. Something that when a medication runs out, are we obligated to replace it, to replace the supply? It's a big question.
Are you able to wean off those medications to see whether they're able to do a something?
All I can say is there is halachic room for not continuing that kind of medical heart support intravenously, which is why it's, but again, each situation is different. It really depends on particulars. But
if that medication isn't causing their heart to start again or causing them to breathe or something, we would not leave it out.
well, there is medication that actually supports the heart. It supports the blood pressure. I don't know what it's called medically, but without it, the patient won't make it, and with it, the patient will continue to die slowly. So, yes. Got it. Yeah. Yes.
I'm listening to Rabbi Ilan, and since he's a doctor too, he said that this particular process of where the machine stops, we have to reevaluate, is a reality. It's possible to reevaluate the situation of the start.
To continue. Makes sense. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
A couple things. One, in terms of the one case where it charged damages, right?
Yes.
If I understood correctly, that has interplay with the degree of pain and suffering the person's going through.
It does have interplay with that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then,
But not to shorten the life, not to actively shorten or remove that which would otherwise be maintaining life. In other words, the pain and suffering of a person doesn't allow us to cause the person to die sooner. It may allow us not to intervene to prolong life, but the fact that there's pain and suffering of a patient doesn't allow us to cause his demise earlier.